Thank you very much for joining. This session covers the root causes and deep drivers of global social turbulence. So I welcome you to what promises to be a highly informative panel on the root causes of the human and planetary condition we find ourselves in. The panel is the subject also of a thought piece prepared for the launch of this conference. I'll therefore briefly present that. I'll try and keep it very brief so that we have ample time to hear from what are a superb set of insightful panelists. Let me just put that up. So the conference paper was authored by Garry Jacobs and myself. It covers the sources and solutions for global turbulence. It's quite wide-ranging, and I feel very privileged to have worked with Garry on it. The contours that are the backdrop of the work we're doing are the following. Today's rapidly changing world. So the accelerated disintegration of the current world order, advancing and dangerous as it is, world issues that require urgent attention, but do not have the leadership or the resources allocated. World splitting, unfortunately, into nations with might and those without might, a much more predatory and difficult world. America feeling that it is time for it to extract value from the world rather than lead or collaborate on global challenges. Allies, therefore, becoming counterparties with extreme rivalry rising and competition. American might and vulnerabilities yet to be tested, but no doubt will be in the time ahead. And the world letting itself much more to spheres of influence and webs of new alliances. Wars remaining unsolved with solutions set to potentially heighten future conflict because they don't necessarily address the root causes of the conflict. Economic inequality as a key driver of populism and extreme governments and forms of government, with migration as providing the fuel, and technology supremacy becoming central to military and economic power, which only a few nations can afford to play at. So this is quite a different world from the world that we thought we were living in only a short while ago. In the paper, we point to essentially three types of failures or root causes and drivers: economic, environmental, and social failures, peace and security failures, and scientific and technological failures. This panel will explore these in much more detail, but essentially, if I run through them very briefly, the economic, environmental, and social failures are essentially ones that are to do with the inequality of growth, the provision of basic needs leading to a crisis of those, fractured societies between those that have and those that don't have, and profit being prioritized over the planet. The peace and security failures are about the weakness of our democracies today and other forms of government, particularly democracies, outsource security, an attack on truth, leading to various forms of post-truth communities, societies, and world orders, potentially. Justice denied without reconciliation, past wounds simply are the fuel for future conflicts. And on the scientific and technological failures, despite the massive advances in science and technology, we have runaway innovation, technology as a weapon rather than a tool, unequal access and disparities where some parts of the world haven't yet, it seems, even begun to participate in technological advances that have characterized the last 2 centuries or 3. And those that are so advanced, they're pushing at the boundaries. And then global division, fragmented efforts to tackle the shared risks, but very fragmented. That was as brief as I could make it so we could actually enjoy the fruits of the talent that we have on this panel. And I'm delighted to introduce that panel and in the following way. In the big picture, societal development over a long time series has clearly advanced with rules of law, human rights, multilateralism, and the establishment of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It just seems that in the last decade, we've regressed, and today we seem to have lost that truth and the rigor of science and technology and the analytic approach. Our leaders seem to have lost the moral right to lead, and we seem to have lost, therefore, limits to behavior that we impose on each other and agreed only a short while ago, post the last Great War. And as a result, we lose the sanctity of borders, the rules of engagement, and the effectiveness of multilateral institutions. And this leads us to, no doubt, a far more brutal world. We know that all action has consequence, and we're currently storing up consequences, karma, one might say. So we're going to hear from this great panel, and I will introduce each one and then pose the question that each of them will address themselves to. I'll ask each panelist to do it briefly because it would be good to talk to each other and not simply give the speeches. Massamba THIOYE is currently acting as a principal advisor for several UN-led organizations, including the UNFCCC, Secretariat, and the Global Carbon Council. He's focused his career on policy, rules, incentives, and he was the founder of the UN Change Global Initiative Innovation Hub, and he retired from the UNFCCC Secretariat recently. Joe Nurse has held senior roles within the UK government, the UN, and the Commonwealth, and is currently advancing a strategic plan to address existential security threats, which she defines very broadly, and is a partner of the World Academy of Art and Science in this endeavour. Professor Stephen HARTMAN is the founding executive director of the Bridges Coalition and in UNESCO's management of social transformations, and has an enormous effort on the transformation also of education, and is part of the institute set up by Anne Wrigley at ASU. My key question I would like to, and Garry Jacobs, sorry, needs no introduction, I'm sure. Garry is the president and leads of the World Academy of Art and Science, and has led this effort for us to all come together to have this discussion. The key question I'd like to pose, and I'd like to begin with Garry, is from your experience and expertise, Garry, help us make sense of the root causes and deep drivers of the turbulence that we're experiencing in the world across so many fields: political, military, economic, technological, social, cultural, and ecological. Very briefly, please, Garry. Sorry, Garry, you're on mute, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sure.
I think that's a long list, and some of them have been touched on already, and so I don't want to repeat the ones that have already been discussed either in the plenary or in the session we just had. But I'd like to mention some perspectives that I hope will add on to this and be complemented by others. One of them is I think what we're seeing now is a revolt against the rapid pace of social evolution. I talked about it as the stress generated by that rapid pace. But I think we're also seeing a backlash against the positive initiatives that have taken place. An example would be the values adopted in Agenda 2030. We managed to get 193 countries to come together and a consensus on it, but that didn't mean that there was total buy-in from the world. When we adopted goals for addressing climate change, even if it meant working out the fossil fuels, that didn't mean that everybody in the world or every country in the world or all powers in the world were behind it. And I think this is a natural sequence we've seen in the past when, for example, we had the French Revolution, and a decade later it turned into a new type of empire instead of democracy, is an example. There are many. We had women's rights adopted in the US, 1922. My grandmother was a suffragette for women's rights. But we see even 100 years later that there are portions of the population that still resist to it. Even 150 years after the end of the Civil War, we see backlash from parts of the population that never bought into it. And I think when the sense of that forward progress becomes very intense, it also leads to a mobilization of the forces that really don't want to see that happen. And therefore, the speed of change is not only creating stress to adapt, but it's also raising resistance that feels this is the last chance we have to set up and speak out and stop this. And I think we're seeing this in the US very markedly today. A second cause is the end of the Cold War, which is a big subject in itself, led to some marvelous achievements and breakthroughs and rapid progress in many respects. But it also left a vacuum, a power vacuum. And that power vacuum could have been closed by, say, the dissolution of NATO, for argument's sake, or a really global cooperative system. But instead of that, those that had the advantage on the power said, why should we talk about, say, sharing it now? And in fact, this has led to an aggravation of the issues that weren't addressed effectively at the end of the Cold War. A third area for which is, fortunately for us, most of these topics are going to come back for discussion in other sessions because none of them can be done given due attention in this. And I think one of the issues we really need to grapple with is the phenomenon of social power, which ironically is never addressed, even in our economic theory. We teach doctrine, it came out in the last session as well in a different way. We teach theory, economic theory of how the world works, or political theory about how a democracy works, and usually ignore the elephant that's in the room, and that is how power is being driven not by what the law says, not by what the systems or the theories say, but by really who has the power. And we've seen a tremendous expansion of the power of money in global society, the power of money even in democracy, which is tending more and more to plutocracy and more resembling what we knew in Eastern Europe during the Cold War and all. So these are trends that really we need to take note of, and academically, intellectually, these need to be at the top of the agenda of the intellectuals rather than being brushed under the surface by theories like shareholder profit and things like that. And I'll just mention a couple of others and stop there. After the end of the Cold War, we've had a globalization of finance and a power of finance moving beyond the nation states and the power of the nation states. We've had a globalization of corporations in an unprecedented way. That's 1 minute left. You mentioned, I think, Ketan and others have mentioned the economic inequality and the corporatization of the media, I think are among those that are of central importance.
Thank you, Garry. Thank you for those insights. Massamba, I'm going to bring it to you because I know that you continue to be very committed and dedicated to the climate cause, and you see around the world how publics and their governments are withdrawing many of the initiatives that they backed on climate. What do you see as the deep drivers and the causes that are leading us to this place?
Thank you, Ketan, and very pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this very important panel. So for me, the root cause of the global social turbulence is the inner development crisis that gave rise to critical civilizational flows. It has 5 interlinked, systemic, and often mutually reinforcing deep drivers arising from these civilizational flows, and it manifests itself through widespread protest, polarization, migration crises, authoritarian resurgence, and socioeconomic unrest. Now, the global inner development crisis is a widespread systemic shortfall in the psychological, emotional, moral, and spiritual maturity that is needed to address the complex challenges of our time: climate change, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, and consumption of natural resources beyond planetary boundaries, inequalities, polarization. All these things, we do not have the tool, the spiritual maturity to face them. And it is the inner dimension of the outer crisis that is what I call global inner development crisis. And it manifests itself through several elements. One first element is that aspect of inner development, such as self-awareness and self-regulation, are increasingly rare. The world is experiencing widespread emotional reactivity, impulsiveness, ego-driven behavior, and the inability to manage stress, particularly among leaders. And there is an over-identification of citizens with consumption, status, or identity role instead of a grounded self-understanding. So for both leaders and citizens, there is a poor mental health, burnout, and internal fragmentation. In addition, the world is displaying a generational decrease in empathy, a rise in narcissism, and an emotional numbness. And there are demonstrations of inability or unwillingness to feel or act on the suffering of others, as well as a desensitization to violence, inequality, or planetary destruction, probably due to overwhelm or habituation. We can also observe a rise in loneliness, isolation, and lack of genuine connection, despite digital hyperconnectivity. There is a loss of meaning and purpose, especially among youth and urban population. And people's behavior reflect a moral confusion and ethical relativism. And when it comes to the ecosystem breakout and climate change, the reason are that humans are more and more disconnected from nature. They are seeking independence and competition rather than interdependence and collaboration. And the big challenge, like climate and sustainability, can only be addressed through radical collaboration. But we are facing serious challenge and difficulties to collaborate both among nations and within nations. The world leadership has demonstrated underdeveloped system thinking and wisdom capacity. It has difficulties navigating complexity, uncertainty, and paradox, displaying binary thinking, promoting a blame culture, and a simplistic solution to deep systemic problems. They see the world as a zero-sum game. We will necessarily have winner and loser, and they are therefore unable to conciliate divergent interest and balance short-term demand with long-term flourishing. And the collective narrative and share value have collapsed. So it means that the global social turbulence is not just a doing crisis, it is also a being crisis. So the inner development crisis is not just psychological, it is civilizational. Our outer crises reflect a collective immaturity of consciousness, a deep civilizational flow, which prioritize control over care, consumption over communion, speed over depth, and have led to societies that are characterized by extractive economic paradigm, unsustainable value system, and inadequate global governance, with a lack of effective multilateralism and planetary stewardship. Now, arising from this civilizational flow, there are the 5 interlinked, systemic, and often mutually reinforcing deep driver of this global social turbulence. They are the structural inequality and economic dislocation, an environmental and climate disruption, political disempowerment and governance deficit, cultural fracture and identity politics, and technological disruption and information disorder. So I will stop there and probably will come to elaborate on this element later on.
Massamba, thank you, because you went straight from the technical drivers to the deep spiritual underlyings and psychological underlyings of our dilemmas. Thank you very much. I was going to come straight to Joe, and but I'm tempted, Joe, if you don't mind, I'm going to come to Stephen, because Stephen, this I imagine resonates very much with you, and you have your own profound reflections on the condition and what drove us here. Do you mind sharing those with us, please?
Yes, I'm happy to, and let me once again congratulate the World Academy of Art and Science on organizing this conference. It's really much needed, and I'm expecting that this is going to have some significant outcomes. So thanks very much to the whole team at WAAS. Yeah, I think if I were to think about the question that you began with, about from my experience, let's say, or area of expertise, how can we begin to make sense of the deep drivers of turbulence that we're experiencing? I would say there are, of course, numerous, but if I were to pinpoint one of them I would say is a certain lack of inclusion and agency for too many people in the world population. And I would say as well that this translates as well into a lack of visibility, lack of empowerment, lack of freedom, and therefore is based on an underlying disenfranchisement that I think also is part of the crisis of multilateralism, I would suggest. So I would like to suggest that, in addressing some of these root causes and deep drivers, that we consider a few ideas. One of them is that we develop greater humility, less hubris about our starting point for thinking about what solutions should be, and how representative our own point of view may be when thinking about potential solutions, as well intended as they may possibly be. And I would go beyond that to maybe suggest that we avoid the risks of overconfident essentialism and universalism, because these tend too often to perpetuate power dynamics that reproduce asymmetrical conditions of participation in the world, participation of individuals, groups, sectors, geographies, cultures. So to move beyond what we shouldn't do, or what I think we ought to try to avoid, to what maybe we need to do more, and we need to be thinking more proactively for, I would say that we need to be feeding processes that build agency and empowerment on terms that none but the most exploitative interests can be anticipated to oppose. Processes, in other words, that cut across lines of ideological or political occupation, by which individuals and groups who feel equally left behind may be too easily provoked and incited to engage against one another while none of them, or most of them, but virtually none of them, are ultimately responsible for creating, shaping, or perpetuating the conditions that they may find themselves in terms of a feeling of desperation, desperate passivity, desperate under the forces of coercion, or desperate at their own invisibility or lack of a sort of political voice. So beyond that, and I'll rely on you, Ketan, to put a finger up when I'm getting close.
Will, don't worry. Keep going.
Beyond that, I'd like to suggest that we think about, again, thinking more proactively, feeding the tree of human capacities. That is care, love, peace, dignity, knowledge, imagination, and ingenuity, among others. These capacities to enable human flourishing at all possible scales. Because we cannot have something working at a certain scale and it's failing at another scale. These things are going to come into direct conflict with one another and bog down efforts to sort of create a salutary development. So I would say that we do this by feeding the tree of human capacities, by nursing the neglected and dying branches and restoring their vitality. And remembering as well that these branches are also the very structures through which different disenfranchised groups, different forgotten, invisible groups participate reciprocally in the flourishing of the entire tree.
Wonderful.
So, and I would also suggest that we always remember that tree, if we think about it, the tree of human of humanity, is but one in a forest of planetary life. The biosphere on which we all depend, all species, all ecosystems, everything depends. If without that, I don't even want to think about it, but we're forced to think about it.
Thank you.
So I don't. I can pause there. And
I'm going to come back to you. I hope we'll have enough time to come back to all of you. Joe, you can see where this is going relative to where one might have imagined, and I'm so happy that it's going in that direction. Joe, you've dealt with existential risk and dedicated this phase of your life to considering what it is and its implications. Draw on that experience, please, and point us to your insights on the causes, the deep roots of how we got here.
Thank you. So firstly, just a big thank you. I think this is a really significant milestone in humanity's existence ultimately, and WAAS can play a really pivotal role, I think, in terms of generating solutions going forward. If we actually look at the situation that we're in today, we can see, and we've heard described already this in these first sessions, the multitude of complex and interacting challenges that ultimately contribute to the risks for our very existence, whether they're planetary through the planetary emergency, especially with tipping points, through the risk of further pandemics, the continued threat of wars, especially nuclear threats, and the challenges of AI. And all of these combined are creating significant threats for the very survival of humanity. So how do we respond as humans? We're scared. We're feeling fearful. We're feeling very insecure. How do we identify and address those root causes as well? Much of what we've heard in these first sessions can be described as symptoms, ultimately, for this global turbulence. Are there kind of common aspects, root causes that we can identify? Certainly what we've heard from the Interaction Council, from leaders, the experience of leaders, and much of what we've heard of today so far is about the failing of leadership, the failing of our leaders, and the failing of our leadership systems, our governance, and multilateral systems. So if we focus particularly on kind of those as root causes, it helps us then to identify solutions. So ultimately, we need to really, what's the purpose of identifying root causes? This is part of the challenge, I think, of these sessions. It's not just to describe them further, it's so that we can understand them and actually take action. And ideally, it's not just taking action on the initial symptoms. It's about having a deep understanding so that we can actually prevent some of these many factors happening in terms of the existence, for example, of humanity, and ensuring our very survival going forward. So, and identifying what can be described as upstream solutions. So, firstly, if we identify then that a failing of leadership is one of the kind of key root causes, and the play out of that as a set of symptoms in terms of the global turbulence that we're feeling. So we can look at the pandemic, for example, because that was a very visible play out of many of the root causes in terms of identifying fear and insecurity as key drivers for what actually happened in the pandemic and the failings of the leadership that happened, and the impacts that we are still feeling today and the patterns that are being repeated. We're only human, okay? And as humans, we've evolved from animals. So we're responding as animals to fear and insecurity, ultimately. And if you look at our physiological responses, our emotional and stress responses to threats, they play out a very familiar pattern. You have a fright that causes a freeze in response, then flight, fight, and fawning. This is a repeated pattern that's seen in animals and humans. We saw this being played out with the pandemic, for example. Big fright in terms of the pandemic. We went into major denial about that. That can be seen as a sort of collective freezing reaction. Then there was absolute chaos when we actually realized what the impact was. That's like a flight reaction. And then there was an uprise of populism, nationalism. That can be seen as the fight, the protective instinct. And then fawn. This is often a new addition to the understanding of this. It's a small deer or something actually just pretending dead. Basically, when you have a strong leader or strong leadership, you withdraw, you fawn in response. So you could see this being played out with the leaders. And ultimately, because of the size of the threat, whole populations were responding like this. And this has allowed the emergence of dominant, powerful leaders who don't always have our best interests at heart. If you actually look at the purpose of leadership from an evolutionary perspective, including animals and across the history of humanity, the evolution of leadership is all about ensuring security and coordinating the activities of a group. Those are the key fundamentals of what leadership is about. And what we've seen from an evolutionary perspective of leadership is that there are three main patterns that have been identified in animals and also in humans. So when a population feels under threat, you want a big chief to stand up and protect you. You want an army. It's quite an instinct. So this is what happened ultimately in the pandemic and then in the global turbulence that we're seeing. We're voting in the big leader, the big chief, because we feel that those leaders will protect us because we feel insecure. But let's look at the other types of leadership that we've seen across centuries. Okay, it's essentially knowledge leaders, experts. That tends to be more dispersed leadership forms. And, you know, much of our democracy is based on kind of knowledge-based leadership skills. Whilst the other kind of key dominant form of leadership is values-based leadership. And values are really essential where we don't know where we're going, but we need a moral compass. So in summary, I think leadership and leadership infrastructure are really key to addressing root causes. So we need to get the infrastructure right. We need to ensure that we set up governance structures to address those. I can talk more later, hopefully. And we need to strengthen our leadership. We need to actually say, what type of leaders do we need to address these complex challenges and actually provide them with the skills? And we've heard much today also, as well, about some of the soft skills that we need. We need the science and the art. We need strategic thinking, planning, so we deal with that fear state effectively, but we also need the soft artistic skills for collaboration and communication. I'm probably done now for this.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
There's developing a consensus amongst you in some ways about what the root causes are, and they come back to the individual and that individual's sense of awareness or being. I'm going to ask Massamba you to begin this. How do you address, though, the fact that the world today has leaders with great power who've decided to extract from others? They are, as you said, perhaps unaware of themselves, perhaps egotistical, perhaps predatory, but that's what they've chosen to do. And those that without the power are not able to fight back. So what is the answer? If we understand the root cause to be fear and a lack of awareness, what's the answer?
Yeah, so I think we need to reinvent the world and we need to reinvent ourselves. And what I mean by reinventing the world, we need to have actions that are more life-centric. And when I say life, it's all form of life, human as well as non-human. And we need to recognize the agency of nature. And we need also to have a vision-driven approach to action. You know, currently our actions are more reactive to solve a problem. This is good, but this is backward looking. We need it in some instances, but it has to be complemented by a more vision-driven approach where we paint the future that we would like to build and we act to get there. It's not about solving a problem, but it's more about building the future that we want. And we need to reinvent ourselves by focusing on 3 core values that are caring, sharing, and daring. And maybe the daring part is one of the elements that can respond to your question. Most of the time, we are setting goals based on our understanding of what is possible. If we think that it's not possible, we do not set it as a goal. And this is actually wrong. Goals need to be set based on what is needed and not based on what is perceived as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Massamba. Stephen, would you reflect on that? Because the realist's view on might and state aggression perhaps would be that it's just a feature of political systems, that people with might use that might on other people. And it's almost their role to do so. It's logical for them to extract value from others. What is the answer to where we are today, though, where that seems to be playing out?
Well, I think part of the answer is not to buy into that narrative. And say, I think maybe that might asserts itself where the system has not been provided for enough structurally and in terms of processes to enable viable alternatives. So in one respect, I think, And I might take that a step further and just say, I agree with you that coming back to the individual is important, and thinking collectively about sort of the individual. I think I would actually identify the problem really not at the individual level, but at the system level, and where the system has gaps that simply need to be remedied, by developing a more inclusive vision, including and reality even of multilateral engagement. So by strengthening certainly intergovernmental and intragovernmental processes and structures, but at the same time creating new significant platforms for agentive participatory engagement of civil society, of academia, of local, traditional, and indigenous communities, of a number of vital sort of nodes of human knowledge and action potential that are simply not engaged, except sometimes in token ways.
Yes.
So beyond that, I would just sort of add that, this involves appreciating, I think, a wider diversity of knowledge systems and action capacities as absolutely necessary for catalyzing transformative renewal of our societies and of the Earth system. Because human activity and it can be either highly damaging or potentially rejuvenative of that Earth system, and we know which direction we need to be moving in. So I think that means putting more emphasis on how we can actually be revitalizing and renewing more inclusive, participatory, agentive, participatory structures that allow us greater voice, which I think can translate into less dissatisfaction at the mass level.
And Stephen, just a quick supplementary. At Bridges and ASU, is this what you are trying to do? You're looking for some way to create a systemic change, galvanizing the individual through education and other means?
Yeah, certainly galvanizing the individual, but also recognizing the enormous resources that are simply ignored in terms of knowledge communities, and how that is a resource we cannot afford to be ignoring. And I mean that even in the science policy process, but also in terms of then how those policies get carried into practice on the ground. There's enormous wisdom and knowledge that we can be drawing on, and we're not.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Joe, you worked with government and in government, and you understand how slowly sometimes this moves and how rapidly it's moved in other places where power has been centralized. How do you think we address this question? What is the solution to this? We're facing powerful, mighty forces. How do we make systemic change?
So we make systemic change by addressing the root causes. We've identified a failing of leadership and leadership infrastructures. So we need a two-pronged approach. One is about strengthening governance mechanisms like the multilateral system to address the actual threats that we're faced with. And ultimately, we need to be strategic and have a strategic plan and plans to address those. We also need to strengthen individual leadership because the infrastructure is made up of individuals. So we need to create a new generation of leaders that actually have the right skills to address these challenges and to act as part of the transition of the type of leaders that we need for the future. So with the Interaction Council, we've already set up a board called the Existential Security Threats Board to try and model and demonstrate the type of governance that we need going forward for the future. It's an intergenerational board with young people sat at the leadership table. We have a series of plans, a plan for the planet, a plan for people, and a plan for peace. These are to start a discussion and to help provide frameworks for planetary leaders. So this is something particularly we're taking forward with the World Academy of Art and Science to actually create leaders for the future, to develop the skills that are needed. That's really instrumental. part of this as well also is about identifying innovative and creative solutions, digital tools and solutions that already exist that can scale up action through innovation, and also to support a wider social movement. And there's ongoing discussions, and we're setting up a new arts movement under the umbrella of the World Academy of Art and Science to try and mobilize in a positive way to engage young people, to engage partners in terms of actually how do we envisage this new world that we want to make together.
Thank you, Joe. Garry, a final word, please. We're in the last few minutes.
Very interesting discussions, really rich discussions that we can build on in the next of the sessions. I'd like to make a couple of comments building on the emphasis that Joe has been putting on fear and insecurity as key drivers, and the comment of Stephen about the need for engagement and at the lower levels and participation. And I think they're related to each other. One way of thinking about this, I think it's complementary to what we've heard, is, the development of the SDGs was an enormous, unprecedented event in history when the leaders of the world, we talk about a failure of leadership, and I understand what we mean, but this was unprecedented leadership in bringing 193 countries agreeable on the future of humanity. It's never happened in history up until now. But I think there was a failure, and not out of intention, but the failure was we weren't able to conceive and communicate this in a language that made it clear to the rest of the world, I mean the masses in the world, that this is really for them. When we talked about 17 SDGs and we talked about carbon emissions and abstractions of all types, which made sense to the diplomats, made sense to the politicians, the policymakers, and the scientists, but I don't think we succeeded in making sense to the people as to what this means for them. And that is the rationale for the emphasis that the Academy has been taking on human security. Human security is to take the wisdom that was there in the SDGs and translate it into a language that says, this is for you, this is for people, this goes all the way down, because the SDGs really would be for everybody. But we didn't have a mechanism to communicate that, or an understanding that it's not enough that the diplomats buy into this, it's necessary that the lowest levels of society buy into it. And ironically, if you see what's happened in the US, for example, and not just the US, the lowest levels of the society have felt they're being left out by the progressiveness of multilateralism. We didn't do a good job of making it clear that this is really for the people. It's not just, how we got extremism, polarization, and rejection of the liberal values by lower levels of the population who voted for extreme right is because the message never came down in a language that they understood it. And so I think Joe's right about the insecurity, and I think that Stephen's right about the need for the messaging and involvement. It is a question of finding out what people think down below. It's a question of communicating with them and making them understand that we have been listening to, in many respects, to what their fundamental needs are, ecological needs, and so forth. And we're trying to change the world. And I think that also, and I'll close with this, I think that also explains why, in the absence of that real understanding, and I'm not even blaming anybody, this change has been so dramatic in history. When have our leaders been trained to handle this crisis, to handle issues of this magnitude and changes that are going on? But I think at the same time, our leaders didn't know how to handle it, and that gave space for reactionary leadership to emerge and address. They were closer. Some of our reactionary leaders are closer to the masses, not for the good of the masses, but knowing how to appeal to their fears and their anxiety and their insecurity, they did a better job of it than those who had been really working to address those needs. So I think we really have to understand the psychology of those who feel they're going to lose their power and would say anything to win over the masses to support them, because they really feel the power of the past is being threatened. At the same time, we didn't do a good job to mobilize the masses who could benefit most by the direction we were going in.
Thank you, Garry. What a great way to draw it together. I'm going to add a final sum up and thank this panel very much for actually digging deep. I know that it is tempting to look for simple solutions, and you haven't. You've gone deep almost into your souls to find the answer and into your personal experience. And I think you very much answered the question. I think it leaves us almost saying that the problems that we have are perhaps twofold. One are internal problems, as you began, Massamba, putting us on this journey on this panel. It's an internal question. Everything we see on the outside is some reflection inside. And I think, as both Stephen and Joe echoed that in some way, the external that we're seeing as the consequence has roots that we need to solve in each of us individually and systemically now. And perhaps, drawing on what Garry said, if we revisited the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement and the IPCC report, and all the other great things, human rights agreements and so on that we've struck, but we looked at through the lens of the internal conflict that we have and shortcomings that have not been addressed, and see how they reflect on the system. And we also look at the system design. We may do it differently. We may implement differently. We may find different metrics that allow us to progress. Thank you very much for those insights. Thank you.